Welcome to the Debunkers Podcast. Okay, let's unpack this. There's a topic that, well, despite decades of scientific work, it just keeps coming back up, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Sparking, really intense debate and, frankly, deep concern for a lot of parents.
Oh, absolutely.
The whole conversation around vaccines and autism, it's so emotionally charged, often driven by headlines, personal stories. It feels incredibly hard to sort through it all.
You're completely right. And what often gets missed, I think, in the public chat, which tends to be very black and white, right, is the real nuance that exists within the actual science. So our mission today is really to try and cut through some of that noise. We want to go beyond, the big headlines and the really moving personal stories and actually dig into the scientific findings. What do the experts actually conclude on this? It's critical.
Yeah.
And it is complex. So we're going to synthesize quite a stack of sources for you. Everything from, rigorous peer-reviewed studies right through to public health reports to try and build a comprehensive picture, a properly informed one.
Okay, so where do we start? It feels like this debate didn't just appear out of nowhere.
No, not at all. Our journey here really begins, maybe surprisingly, not in a lab initially, but with a pretty infamous moment in medical history. We have to go back to 1998.
Right.
There was this single paper published in a very well-respected medical journal, The Lancet, and this is where that persistent question about the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, rubella, and autism really just exploded into the public consciousness.
All down to one British doctor, Andrew Wakefield.
That's the one. It's quite a story, actually, about how quickly one piece of research, which, spoiler alert, was later proven to be fraudulent, can just take root and, create enormous public fear.
So what did that 1998 paper actually claim?
Well, Wakefield's paper focused on just 12 children, 12 patients, and they all had this combination of inflammatory bowel disease and developmental disorders. The crucial part, though, was that the paper suggested there might be a link, a possible connection between the MMR vaccine and the onset of autism in these specific kids.
Only 12 kids. That seems like a tiny sample.
Yeah. It was incredibly small and not randomized, not representative. But despite that, the claim just gained huge traction. The media picked it up widely, and it ignited this, wildfire of speculation and worry among parents really across the globe.
And the immediate impact was pretty stark, wasn't it? I remember hearing about vaccination rates really dropping off.
Oh, profoundly.
Yeah.
It led to a very sharp, very concerning drop in childhood vaccination rates. Particularly noticeable in places like the UK and Ireland, parents were, understandably terrified.
Yeah.
Public trust was definitely shaken. And the consequences for public health, they became apparent almost right away. But it actually wasn't that long before really serious questions started popping up. Scientific questions, ethical questions about Wakefield's methods, his integrity.
What kind of questions?
Well, subsequent investigations, really thorough ones, they didn't just find significant methodological flaws, things like, cherry-picking patients that fit his theory, failing to disclose data that didn't fit, even manipulating results. But also, and this was huge, outright undisclosed conflicts of interest. For example, it turned out Wakefield had been paid quite substantially by lawyers who were actually gearing up to sue vaccine manufacturers.
Seriously?
Yes, and he even had a patent application for a separate measles vaccine himself, one that, would have potentially benefited financially if the combined MMR vaccine was discredited. These weren't just minor slip-ups, they hit right at the heart of scientific ethics.
So this wasn't just bad science, it was deliberate.
The findings pointed strongly towards that. It wasn't seen as just a simple mistake or misinterpretation. It was framed as something far, far more serious.
How did the scientific community officially respond when all this came out?
The response was pretty unequivocal and, frankly, devastating for Wakefield's career. The evidence of misconduct was so clear, so demonstrably fraudulent, that The Lancet took the very rare step of formally retracting the paper entirely in 2010.
Retraction is a big deal in science publishing.
It's huge, reserved for really serious cases of misconduct. And for Wakefield himself, the consequences were just as severe. He was stripped of his medical license by the General Medical Council in the UK, essentially ended his career as a practicing doctor. His work was officially labeled an elaborate fraud. Quite a dramatic fall, considering how central his claims had become to public anxiety.
But here's the thing that's always struck me. How did this single, retracted, fraudulent paper become so ingrained? Why does it still echo today, even after being so thoroughly debunked?
That is the critical question, isn't it? Because after that 98 paper, the scientific community really did mobilize. I mean, in a massive way. Multiple huge epidemiological studies were launched specifically to investigate Wakefield's claim about MMR and autism.
These weren't small studies then.
Not at all. These were large-scale, really robust investigations across different continents. Denmark, the UK, Finland, the US. We're talking studies involving millions of children, followed over many, many years.
And the results?
Consistently, study after study, the findings were the same. No link, no connection found between the MMR vaccine and autism. Just think about the major health bodies that weighed in. The CDC in the US, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Institute of Medicine, part of the National Academy of Sciences, the UK's National Health Service, the Cochrane Library.
Cochrane is highly respected for reviewing evidence.
Exactly. They're known for being incredibly thorough and independent. All of them conducted these exhaustive reviews of all the available evidence, and every single one reached the identical conclusion. MMR does not cause autism.
Can you give an example of the scale?
Sure. There was a huge meta-analysis in 2014. That means they combined the data from lots of previous studies. This one involved over 1.25 million children. Its finding, vaccinations were not associated with autism.
Wow, 1.25 million.
And then, maybe even more powerfully, a massive Danish study published in 2019. They followed over 650,000 children for more than 10 years. Again, no link found. And importantly, they specifically looked at children who had autistic siblings, a group considered to have a higher genetic risk. Even in that higher risk group, there was no increased risk of autism after the MMR vaccine.
So the scientific refutation was overwhelming.
Absolutely overwhelming. It really highlights, the painstaking process of scientific validation, but it also shows how powerfully discredited research can still resonate in the public mind. It really makes you ask, how do we as a society get better at telling the difference between, genuine scientific inquiry and claims that are misleading, especially when those claims tap into such deep-seated fears?
And you have to think the media played a part in that resonance, right? The idea of science by press conference.
Oh, definitely. Many observers rightly criticized how the mass media handled it initially. They essentially gave Wakefield's flawed study far more weight, far more credibility than it ever deserved scientifically. This created what people called a misleading impression.
The whole balanced reporting thing.
Exactly. It's this concept of false balance. Journalists, maybe trying to be impartial, end up presenting two opposing views as if they have equal standing, even when one side has mountains of evidence and the other has, well, in this case, a single fraudulent paper.
Right.
This, on the one hand, on the other hand, approach just completely blurred the lines. It confused people. It made it seem like there was a genuine scientific debate where increasingly there wasn't one regarding MMR. It's like, giving equal time to a climate scientist and someone who insists the Earth is flat to achieve balance on climate change.
That's a good analogy.
And we also have to acknowledge, as pointed out in articles in places like the New England Journal of Medicine, that anti-vaccine activists became very skilled at using modern communication. TV, the internet, social media. They leveraged these platforms expertly to sway a public opinion.
How did they do that? What were the tactics?
Often it involves tapping into a deep mistrust of government or pharmaceutical companies, sometimes leaning into conspiratorial thinking. There can be outright denialism of established facts, and very often substituting really compelling, emotional, personal stories, anecdotes for solid scientific data. These tactics are powerful because they connect on an emotional level, tapping into genuine fears people have.
Which brings us to this idea of folk epidemiology. What exactly is that?
It's a fascinating concept. It refers to these popular beliefs that circulate about what causes complex conditions like autism, beliefs that are often shaped more by rumors, by misinformation spread through media and online networks than by actual scientific evidence.
And why do these beliefs stick around so stubbornly, even when the science is so clear?
Yeah, it's remarkable and frankly frustrating for public health folks just how persistent these misinformed beliefs can be. There's some deep psychological reasons. First, there's confirmation bias. We all tend to look for and believe information that confirms what we already think, and we ignore or dismiss stuff that contradicts it.
Right, we filter things.
Exactly. Second, people often misjudge source reliability. A really compelling story from a celebrity or a passionate parent sharing their experience can feel more trustworthy than a dense, complicated scientific study, even if the study is much more reliable.
Anecdotes are powerful.
Incredibly powerful. That's the third point. Anecdotal evidence. Hearing a story, my child got a vaccine and then they started showing signs of autism, even if the timing is purely coincidental, That story can be far more persuasive to many people than piles of epidemiological data showing no statistical link. And finally, there's just a general reluctance to revise opinions. Once we form a belief, especially an emotionally charged one, it's actually quite hard psychologically to let it go, even if the original source is proven wrong, like the Wakefield paper.
And we still see this today.
Absolutely. There was a report just recently, June 2024, in Ars Technica. It highlighted a survey showing that a staggering 24% of U.S. adults still either denied or disputed the CDC's clear stance that vaccines don't cause autism. 24%. That figure was pretty much unchanged from 2018.
Wow.
And a smaller but still significant group, about 10% in 2023, up slightly from 9% in 2021, still firmly believe that vaccines definitely or probably cause autism. It just shows how deeply embedded these narratives have become for some people.
Of course, this isn't just about beliefs. It spilled over into the legal system too, didn't it? Lawsuits against manufacturers.
Oh, definitely. There were numerous lawsuits, especially back in the 80s and 90s, even before the Wakefield paper amplified things, claims that vaccines caused various physical and mental disorders. While most were unsuccessful, they unfortunately did contribute to driving up the costs of producing vaccines like NMR.
How so?
While the legal environment became really challenging, the risk of litigation, the cost of insurance, and legal defense, it got so bad that at one point, Merck was almost the only company still willing to sell the MMR vaccine in both the US and the UK. The legal risks were just seen as too high by others.
And what about that big UK class action suit based on Wakefield's claims?
Right, that was a major case. Launched in 1994, even before the paper was published, based on his preliminary work. It was funded by public legal aid money, but it eventually collapsed in 2007.
Why did it collapse?
The High Court judge essentially ruled that most of the claims had to be dropped because the legal aid funding was withdrawn. And why was it withdrawn? Because the Legal Services Commission determined there was a high probability of failure based on the medical evidence.
So the evidence just wasn't there.
Exactly. And think about the cost. Something like $15 million in public legal aid was spent on that lawsuit. About $10 million went to lawyers, nearly $5 million to expert witnesses, a massive amount of public money, and it yielded zero scientific validation for the claims.
We saw something similar in the U.S. with the vaccine court, right? The omnibus autism proceeding.
Yes, the OAP. That was set up within the U.S. vaccine court system. Now, this court is a bit different. It's a no-fault system. It was created in the 80s to compensate people potentially injured by vaccines without them having to prove manufacturer negligence in a traditional lawsuit.
Okay.
But this system got completely overwhelmed. Almost 5,000 petitions were filed claiming vaccines caused autism. So they set up the OAP to handle these claims in a coordinated way. In 2007, they chose 3 key test cases. These are specifically looking at the claim about the MMR vaccine, possibly combined with thimerosal-containing vaccines.
And the outcome of those test cases.
After really extensive hearings, lots of expert testimony, the special masters in the vaccine court ruled definitively against the plaintiffs in all 3 cases. They concluded the evidence just didn't support the claim that vaccines caused autism, either in those specific children or more broadly. It was a pretty clear judicial rejection of the hypothesis.
But hang on, wasn't there one case, the Bailey Banks case, where the family did win something? That one gets mentioned a lot.
Ah, yes, the Bailey Banks case. It is often mentioned, but is frequently misrepresented. The family did receive compensation from the Vaccine Injury Program. But, and this is absolutely crucial, it was not for autism.
Not for autism. What was it for then?
The ruling was for non-autistic developmental delay. The special master in that specific case determined that the MMR vaccine had caused a condition called acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, or ADIM, in the child. ADIM is a rare type of brain inflammation.
Okay, so brain inflammation, not autism.
Exactly. The ruling was based on the fact that in very rare instances, natural measles, mumps, or rubella infections can cause ADIM, and previous vaccine court cases had accepted that the vaccine itself could, extremely rarely, also trigger ADIM. So they compensated for the ADIM and the resulting developmental delay. But it was explicitly not an autism diagnosis or finding. That case confirmed a different, known, very rare vaccine side effect, completely separate from the autism question.
That's a really important clarification. So bringing it all together, the fallout from that one fraudulent paper was just immense. Not just eroding trust, but actual, tangible, negative consequences for public health.
Devastating is not too strong a word. Look at the UK again. MMR vaccination rates dropped from a safe 92% in '96 down to 84% by 2002. In some parts of London, it was as low as 61% by 2003.
That's way below herd immunity levels. Right?
Way below. Herd immunity is what protects the whole community, especially those who can't be vaccinated, like tiny babies or people with weakened immune systems. When rates fall that low, diseases come back.
And they did.
Predictably and tragically, yes. Measles cases in the UK, which had been almost wiped out, soared. From just 56 cases in 1998 to nearly 450 in just the first 5 months of 2006. This led to the UK's first measles death in 14 years. Mumps also surged, hitting epidemic levels in 2005 with almost 5,000 cases reported in a single month.
Unbelievable.
By 2008, measles was officially declared endemic again in the UK. Endemic. For the first time in 14 years, a direct result of falling vaccination rates fueled by the scare. And it wasn't just the UK. Ireland had a big outbreak in 2000, 1,500 cases, 3 deaths.
Yeah.
Italy, Switzerland, outbreaks followed the drop in vaccination rates.
And there were severe complications too.
Yes, really serious ones. For instance, 2 children in London who had received kidney transplants tragically suffered severe permanent brain injury from measles encephalitis after being exposed. These weren't just statistics, they were devastating human costs.
Experts have been pretty blunt about where they place the blame for this resurgence.
They have. Dr. Paul Offit, a pediatrician who's been a very outspoken critic of the anti-vaccine movement for years, stated flatly that Wakefield's paper killed children. He specifically linked at least 4 measles deaths to its influence.
Wow.
And Bill Gates, focusing on global health, was even more forceful. He said anti-vaccine myths killed thousands of kids, and that people promoting them kill children. These are incredibly strong statements, but they reflect the gravity of the consequences.
And the financial cost. Just dealing with these preventable outbreaks.
Also staggering, AOL's Daily Finance did an estimate back in 2011. A measles outbreak in Italy from 2002-2003, which hospitalized over 5,000 people. They estimated the cost at between 17.6 and 22 million euros, just in direct medical and public health costs.
Wow.
Smaller outbreaks still cost a lot. Iowa, 2004, measles outbreak, over $142,000 to contain. Chicago, 2006, mumps outbreak linked to unvaccinated employees, over $260,000. These preventable diseases place a huge financial burden on the healthcare system, on taxpayers.
It really puts the idea of vaccine hesitancy into perspective, doesn't it? When individual choices, maybe based on misinformation, directly impact community health and lead to these kinds of outcomes.
It highlights that profound interconnectedness of public health. Your choice not to vaccinate doesn't just affect you or your child, it affects the whole community, especially the most vulnerable. And it's worth mentioning, too, the role some celebrities played in amplifying these fears.
Right, like Jenny McCarthy.
Exactly. She became a very public face, blaming vaccines for her son's condition, warning other parents. Medical experts later suggested her son's symptoms actually sounded more like Landau-Kleffner syndrome, which can be misdiagnosed as autism because it affects language. But she continued to defend Wakefield and became a really visible advocate for anti-vaccine claims, drawing sharp criticism from public health officials. It just shows how powerful celebrity influence can be in spreading health information or misinformation.
Okay, so that covers the MMR controversy quite extensively. But there was another major concern that emerged around the same time, right? The thimerosal hypothesis.
Yes, absolutely. So the idea that mercury in vaccines, specifically from a preservative called thimerosal, was causing autism also gained a lot of traction.
But again, the science told a different story.
Indeed, it did. Thimerosal is an organic compound. It contains about 50% mercury by weight. Historically, it was used in multi-dose vaccine vials.
Why?
Basically to prevent contamination. Once you puncture the vial to draw out a dose, there's a risk of bacteria or fungi getting in. Thimerosal acted as a preservative to keep the remaining doses sterile and safe.
So why did it come under scrutiny?
Well, in 1999, it became a focus, not really because of direct evidence showing harm from vaccines, but more as part of a general public health push to reduce overall mercury exposure for everyone, especially kids, from all sources.
A precautionary thing.
Exactly. It was a precautionary principle approach. The FDA and CDC recommended that manufacturers work towards reducing or eliminating thimerosal from vaccines given to infants. They even suggested, temporarily, suspending the birth dose of the hepatitis B vaccine until thimerosal-free versions were readily available. But, and this is key, it was done out of an abundance of caution, not because there was solid evidence that thimerosal in vaccines had actually caused any harm, including autism.
Okay, but it does contain mercury, so what's the distinction people need to understand? Isn't all mercury bad?
That is the absolute critical distinction here. There are different forms of mercury. The kind most people worry about, the kind found in some fish or from industrial pollution, is methylmercury. That is a known neurotoxin. It can build up in the body and brain, and it's particularly harmful to developing nervous systems.
Right.
But thimerosal contains ethylmercury. And rigorous scientific studies have shown very clearly that ethylmercury behaves totally differently in the human body compared to methylmercury. It doesn't accumulate in the body or brain in the same way or to dangerous levels. It's metabolized and cleared out of the body much, much more quickly. So while the initial concern was understandable, mercury sounds scary, the science showed that the specific type of mercury in thimerosal in the tiny amounts used in vaccines posed a very different and much, much lower risk profile.
So, after all the research, all the investigation into thimerosal,
Yeah.
what was the final scientific verdict on its link, or lack thereof, to autism?
The scientific consensus is really clear and very consistent on this one, too. Numerous, extensive, rigorous studies, large epidemiological analyses, biological investigations have consistently found no reason for concern about thimerosal in vaccines. They found no consistent evidence whatsoever for any association with autism.
So, that hypothesis just didn't hold up.
It failed to be supported by the actual data, both epidemiological and biological. It's another really good example of how an initial public concern, while maybe understandable on the surface, just wasn't borne out when subjected to thorough scientific investigation. And again, those safety monitoring systems we have in the US were crucial here.
VARS and VSD?
Exactly. The Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, VAORS, that's the one where anyone can report a potential side effect, sort of an early warning system. And the Vaccine Safety Data Link, VSD, that's the more active system, using linked health records from millions of people to proactively monitor safety trends. These systems provided critical data that helped definitively show thimerosal wasn't linked to autism.
Okay, so the MNR link debunked. The thimerosal link debunked by overwhelming evidence. But the conversation doesn't quite end there, does it? Some sources have raised questions about a different component, aluminum adjuvants.
That's right. This shifts the focus somewhat. While the public debate often got stuck on MMR or thimerosal, some scientific papers, particularly in more recent years, have pointed towards aluminum, which is used as an adjuvant in many vaccines.
What's an adjuvant? Why is aluminum in vaccines at all?
Good question. An adjuvant is basically something added to a vaccine to help it work better. Aluminum salts are the most common type used globally. Their job is to provoke a stronger, more sustained immune response to the vaccine's main ingredient, the antigen. This is especially important for babies and young infants whose immune systems are still developing and might not react strongly enough without that extra boost.
Okay, so it helps the vaccine be more effective, but what's the concern some researchers have raised?
The concern highlighted in certain papers, like those by Tomlin-Genovich and Shaw in 2011 or Beretti in 2021, stems from the fact that while aluminum works well as an immune stimulant, it's also known to be a neurotoxin in other contexts at certain exposure levels. So they raise questions about its use in vaccines, particularly the cumulative exposure from multiple shots given early in life.
What specifically did the Tomlin-Genovich and Shaw paper argue?
Their paper made a pretty strong claim. They stated their results were the first to show that aluminum, being neurotoxic and the most common adjuvant, may be a significant contributing factor to the rise in autism spectrum disorder, ASD prevalence, in Western countries.
A contributing factor. How do they support that?
They really emphasized that children, especially infants, aren't just small adults when you're thinking about toxicity. They argued that kids' unique physiology, particularly the fact that their blood-brain barrier, the protective layer around the brain, isn't fully developed early on, makes them potentially much more vulnerable to toxic substances like aluminum getting into the brain. And they highlighted the dose difference. They calculated that infants get a much higher dose of aluminum per kilogram of body weight from vaccines compared to adults. They cited figures suggesting infants might get between 73.5 to 172.5 micrograms per kilo versus about 7.1 for adults from vaccines. They argued this proportional difference is really important and hasn't been adequately studied for safety.
That's a striking difference when put that way.
Yeah.
Did they find any correlations between aluminum exposure and autism rates?
They presented several ecological correlations. Now, correlation doesn't equal causation, that's vital to remember, But these correlations were central to their argument. First, they noted that countries with the highest purported ASD rates, like the UK, US, Australia, Canada, also seem to be countries where children received higher cumulative aluminum exposure from vaccines compared to, say, Scandinavian countries where ASD rates were reported lower, and aluminum exposure from vaccines might also be lower.
Okay, a country-level comparison.
Yes. Second, focusing on the US between 1991 and 2008, they reported finding a highly significant positive linear correlation. The statistical value they gave, Pearson R, was 0.92, which is extremely close to a perfect positive correlation between the estimated aluminum exposure from the childhood vaccine schedule and the rise in ASD prevalence during that period. They also found the number of aluminum-containing vaccines correlated strongly too, R 0.90.
So as aluminum exposure went up, autism rates went up in lockstep, according to their analysis.
That's what their correlation suggested for that specific time period and data set. They also looked across 7 different Western countries and reported finding similar significant positive correlations between cumulative aluminum exposure, especially around 3 or 4 months of age, and ASD prevalence.
Did they try to argue for causation beyond just correlation, using something like Hill's criteria?
They did. They actually applied Sir Austin Bradford Hill's criteria, which are guidelines used in epidemiology to help assess if an observed association is likely causal. They argued their findings met 8 out of the 9 criteria, including things like the strength of the association, consistency across different comparisons, biological plausibility, the temporal relationship, exposure before outcome, and a dose-response gradient.
What was their biological plausibility argument? How might aluminum theoretically contribute to ASD?
Their argument centered on aluminum being a known neurotoxin and a potent immune stimulator. They proposed that repeated exposure through closely spaced vaccinations could lead to chronic immune system activation. This chronic activation, they hypothesized, might disrupt critical stages of brain development, promote inflammation in the brain, neuroinflammation, activate glial cells excessively, and lead to aberrant immune responses, all features that have actually been observed in the brains and immune systems of some individuals with ASD. They also cited work suggesting aluminum can cross that still developing blood-brain barrier.
They also raised issues with the official safety limits for aluminum in vaccines, didn't they?
Yes, that was another key part of their critique. They pointed out that the FDA's upper limit for aluminum per vaccine dose, 850 micrograms, was set based on making the vaccine effective antigenicity, not primarily based on rigorous toxicological studies establishing safety levels specifically for infants. They highlighted what they saw as a paradox. The FDA does have strict limits and warnings about aluminum in intravenous feeding solutions for infants due to toxicity concerns, but seemingly not the same level of required toxicological assessment or warning for vaccines. They argued that basic knowledge about how aluminum adjuvants are processed, distributed, and potentially exert toxic effects in infants, pharmacokinetics and toxicodynamics, is largely lacking, and that evaluating this isn't currently required for vaccine licensing.
Did they question the risk-benefit for specific aluminum-containing vaccines?
They used the hepatitis B vaccine given at birth as an example. They questioned the universal use in newborns, arguing the risk of hep B infection is very low for most infants in developed countries, unless the mother is infected, while the vaccine adds to the early aluminum exposure. They cited some studies, though these studies also mentioned thimerosal, complicating the picture, which they interpreted as suggesting a link between hep B vaccination and developmental issues, including a higher risk of ASD in boys in one dataset. They also mentioned primate studies where a single dose of hep B vaccine reportedly caused neurodevelopmental delays.
And the Beretti paper from 2021. Did it echo these concerns?
It did, strongly. Beretti reviewed similar evidence, the ecological correlations, animal studies showing behavioral changes in mice given aluminum adjuvants, findings of aluminum in brain tissue of individuals with ASD, and concluded that these collectively make a strong case for aluminum adjuvants being responsible for ASD.
Responsible? That's a strong word.
It is, though he did add the caveat that a definitive causative link is missing. But then he went on to assert, quite provocatively, that the evidence that allied aluminum adjuvants in vaccines does not cause ASD is certainly much less than for the opposite claim, basically arguing the safety case hadn't been adequately proven in his view.
And he also criticized the scientific debate itself.
Yes, Beretti claimed that conflicts of interest prevent a healthy scientific debate within the mainstream medical establishment. He also talked about the manufacture of consent through mass corporate media, suggesting the media acts as a system support supportive propaganda function that stifles proper, unbiased discussion of vaccine risks. He even questioned the sheer number of vaccines given, using the number needed to vaccinate concept to suggest maybe not all are essential, or that risks might outweigh benefits for some, citing disputed figures about flu vaccine hospitalizations versus febrile convulsions.
Wow. Okay, so this is definitely a different angle than the MMR or thimerosal discussions. These papers are presenting correlations, proposing biological mechanisms, and even critiquing the regulatory and scientific process around aluminum adjuvants. It really does shift the conversation.
It absolutely does, and it highlights just how complex it is to establish causation for a condition like ASD, which is almost certainly multifactorial, meaning many different genetic and environmental factors likely play a role. It underscores why ongoing, rigorous evaluation of all vaccine ingredients is important, and why the scientific community needs to address these constipating hypotheses transparently, even when they challenge prevailing views. Science is, after all, a process of continuous questioning and refinement.
Right. So while these specific papers raise questions about aluminum, it's crucial to place them in the context of the broader scientific consensus, right? What do the major health organizations looking at all the evidence on vaccines and autism overall still conclude?
Precisely. It's vital to understand the weight of evidence. Major health bodies like the CDC maintain their commitment to ongoing autism research, looking for risk factors, potential causes, improving early identification. That work is robust and continuous.
And their stance on vaccines specifically?
Their stance, and that of numerous global health organizations based on decades of research, remains consistent. The overwhelming body of scientific evidence does not support a causal link between vaccines and autism. This includes studies looking at MMR, thimerosal-containing vaccines, and the overall vaccine schedule.
Can you remind us of some key points supporting that consensus?
Sure. First, the sheer volume and consistency of large-scale epidemiological studies finding no link, like the ones we discussed earlier involving millions of children. Second, the biological plausibility argument from the mainstream perspective. Most experts believe the brain changes underlying autism likely begin before birth, during prenatal development, making a postnatal trigger like vaccines less likely as a primary cause. Even regression, when children lose skills, is increasingly thought to have prenatal origins. Third, the rigorous safety monitoring systems like VARs and VSD are constantly tracking vaccine safety and haven't detected a signal linking vaccines to autism.
And what about specific clinical trials on aluminum adjuvants in autism? You mentioned correlations, but what about direct experimental evidence in humans?
That's a really critical point. A search of clinicaltrials.gov, the main registry for clinical trials worldwide, reveals 0 registered trials specifically designed to investigate a connection between aluminum adjuvants in vaccines and autism in humans. 0. This lack of direct clinical trial evidence is significant. While the correlational studies and biological plausibility arguments raise questions that warrant further investigation, they don't meet the gold standard for proving causation in medicine, which is typically a randomized controlled trial. So the current scientific consensus rests on the vast amount of epidemiological and other biological evidence that does exist, which overwhelmingly does not support a vaccine autism link.
Okay, so that's the state of the science on the vaccine question. Given all this focus on potential causes, maybe we should step back and clarify what autism, or ASD, actually is.
Excellent idea, because understanding the condition itself is key. Autism spectrum disorder, ASD, isn't one single thing. It's a group of complex brain-based neurodevelopmental disorders. They primarily affect 2 main areas: social communication and interaction, and patterns of behavior.
And it's a spectrum, right? What does that mean?
Exactly. The term spectrum was formally adopted around 2007, bringing together previous diagnoses like Asperger's and PDD-NOS. It reflects the incredibly wide range of abilities and challenges people with autism have. It manifests very differently from person to person. You can have individuals who are nonverbal and need significant support, and others with exceptional skills in certain areas but major social difficulties. This sheer diversity is one reason why blaming it on a single environmental factor at one point in time just doesn't really fit the complexity of ASD.
What are those core defining features, then, that everyone on the spectrum shares to some degree?
Despite the diversity, there are those 2 core areas of impairment. First, social communication and interaction difficulties. This might look like troublemaking or keeping friends, lack of interest in peers, difficulty with back-and-forth conversation, problems understanding nonverbal cues like facial expressions or body language, or reduced sharing of interests or emotions. Second, restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. This can include things like repetitive movements, hand flapping, rocking, insistence on sameness, extreme distress at small changes, rigid thinking patterns, highly focused, intense interests in specific topics, or unusual reactions to sensory input, being either overly sensitive or undersensitive to sounds, lights, textures, pain, etc.
And there are often other associated conditions too.
Very often, yes. People with autism frequently experience other challenges alongside the core features. Things like anxiety and depression are common. Aggression can occur, often related to communication difficulties or sensory overload. Sleep problems, epilepsy, significant gastrointestinal issues like chronic constipation or diarrhea, ADHD, certain genetic conditions like Fragile X syndrome, and motor difficulties are all more common in individuals with ASD. It adds layers of complexity to diagnosis and support.
So what do scientists believe causes autism, if not vaccines?
The current scientific understanding is that autism likely results from a complex interaction between genetic factors and environmental influences that occur during critical periods of brain development, probably starting even before birth. It's very rarely just one single cause.
Genetics play a big role then.
A significant role, yes. Specific identifiable gene mutations or chromosomal abnormalities might account for maybe 15-20% of cases, but in many other cases, it's thought to be the combined effect of many common genetic variations, what's called polygenic risk interacting with environmental factors.
What are some of those established risk factors?
We know some things increase the likelihood. Gender is one. Boys are diagnosed about 4 times more often than girls, though the reasons aren't fully understood and might involve biological differences and potential underdiagnosis in girls. Having an older sibling with ASD significantly increases the risk for younger siblings, suggesting a strong genetic component. Studies suggest up to a 20% chance for a younger sibling. Certain prenatal and perinatal factors are also linked, like being born very prematurely or having an extremely low birth weight. Advanced parental age, both mother and father, at conception is also associated with a slightly increased risk. Research continues into other potential environmental contributors, like maternal infections or exposure to certain substances during pregnancy, but it's a very complex area.
The really positive news in all this is the progress made in diagnosing autism much earlier now. That seems crucial.
It's incredibly important. We've made huge strides. Reliable diagnosis is now often possible by 18 to 24 months of age, sometimes even earlier. The American Academy of Pediatrics actually recommends routine autism screening for all toddlers at their 18 and 24-month well-child checkups using validated tools.
What are some of the very early signs parents might notice, even before 18 months?
Yeah, the CDC and groups like Autism Navigator highlight key developmental milestones and red flags. Things like, by 9 months, not making eye contact or not sharing smiles or other joyful expressions. By 9 months, not responding to their name. By 12 months, no babbling or cooing. By 12 months, no back and forth gestures like pointing, showing, reaching, or waving. By 16 months, no single words. By 24 months, no meaningful 2-word phrases, not just imitating. Or, critically, any loss of previously acquired speech, babbling, or social skills at any age. Any of those warrant immediate discussion with a doctor.
And why is catching it that early so vital? What difference does early intervention make?
It makes a massive difference. Study after study confirms that starting intensive, evidence-based behavioral intervention as early as possible leads to the best developmental outcomes. The young brain is incredibly adaptable neuroplasticity, they call it. Early intervention takes advantage of that window. It can significantly improve communication skills, social skills, cognitive abilities, and reduce challenging behaviors. It also provides invaluable support and training for families, strengthens relationships, and really sets the child up for greater long-term success and independence.
So when families do get a diagnosis and are looking for help, what are the treatments that actually work? The ones backed by solid evidence?
That's the critical question. Families need to focus on evidence-based practices. Among the most well-established and effective are behavioral therapies based on the principles of applied behavior analysis, ABA. This isn't just one rigid thing. Modern approaches like naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions, NDBI, and pivotal response training, PRT, are very play-based and child-led, focusing on teaching crucial skills within natural routines.
Okay, so behavioral therapies are key. What else?
Speech therapy is vital for addressing language and communication delays. Occupational therapy helps with fine motor skills, daily living skills like dressing or feeding, and importantly, sensory processing issues. Physical therapy can address gross motor delays or coordination problems. And there are some FDA-approved medications like Risperdal and Abilify, which don't treat the core symptoms of autism but can be very helpful in managing associated issues like severe irritability, aggression, or self-injury in some individuals. Other meds are sometimes used off-label for co-occurring conditions like ADHD or anxiety.
And needs change over time, presumably.
Absolutely. As children with autism grow into adolescents and adults, their support needs evolve. Things like vocational training, social skills groups specifically for teens or adults, support with daily living skills, and planning for higher education or employment become really important.
It's so vital for listeners to hear about what actually helps. That information on early diagnosis and effective treatments really does offer hope. And it stands in such sharp contrast to all the misinformation and, frankly, bogus cures that seem to target families dealing with autism.
It really does. And this brings up a serious ethical issue. Parents of newly diagnosed children are often under immense stress. They're scared, they're desperate for answers, for solutions. This vulnerability, sadly, makes them prime targets for individuals and companies peddling unproven, sometimes even dangerous, treatments that promise miracles but have zero scientific backing.
And these parents, out of love, might even think they see improvements, right?
Exactly. Driven by that intense love and hope, parents might perceive improvements even with placebo treatments. They might be influenced by powerful testimonials online or from other parents who are equally desperate. It's easy to get caught up in hope, especially when faced with such a challenging diagnosis.
There's a disturbingly long list of these unproven or disproven therapies out there, isn't there? Things families should be wary of.
There is, unfortunately, and families need to be incredibly cautious. The list includes things that range from just ineffective to actively harmful. Examples include miracle mineral solution, MMS, which is literally industrial bleach and is highly toxic. Chelation therapy, using chemicals to remove heavy metals. It has no proven benefit for autism and carries serious risks, including death. Various restrictive special diets, like gluten-free, casein-free. While some children might have co-occurring gut issues or allergies that benefit from dietary changes, there's no strong evidence it treats core autism symptoms, and poorly managed diets can cause nutritional deficiencies.
What else is on that list?
Things like hyperbaric oxygen therapy, secretin injections, antifungal treatments, holding therapy, various vitamin megadoses marketed as cures, stem cell therapies, which are still highly experimental and unproven for autism outside of rigorous clinical trials, even things like giant magnets or raw milk. The bottom line is families should always consult with qualified medical professionals, pediatricians, developmental specialists, neurologists, and rely on treatments supported by actual scientific evidence. Critical thinking isn't just for evaluating vaccine claims, it's essential for evaluating treatment claims too, to protect both the child's health and the family's finances from exploitation.
Which brings us right up to the present day, and some really significant policy shifts happening now that directly impact the scientific bodies guiding public health. It definitely makes you think about the future of public trust in these institutions. I'm talking about the recent news regarding ACIP.
Yes, that's a major development, and certainly controversial. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., in his role as health secretary, recently took the pretty unprecedented step of removing all 17 sitting members of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, ACIP.
Can you just remind listeners what ACIP?
Sure. ACIP is, or was, this long-standing committee of independent medical and public health experts. Their job is crucial. They review all the scientific evidence on vaccines and then advise the CDC on how vaccines should be used safely and effectively for the U.S. population. Their recommendations form the basis of the national vaccination schedule and guidelines doctors follow.
And Kennedy removed the entire committee. Why?
His stated reason was to reestablish public confidence in vaccine science. He claimed this required addressing perceived conflicts of interest among the existing members, saying a clean sweep is needed. He also noted that this move allows his administration to appoint a majority of new members much sooner than would otherwise happen through normal term expirations, essentially fast-tracking a change in the committee's makeup. It's worth remembering his long history as a prominent anti-vaccine activist before his appointment.
What's been a reaction from doctors and public health groups to this?
Overwhelmingly negative, sharply critical, really, across the board. Dr. Tom Frieden, a former CDC director, called it dangerous and unprecedented based on false conflict of interest claims, and warned it would likely undermine public trust, not improve it. Dr. George Benjamin from the American Public Health Association literally called it a coup and said it was not good for the health of the nation. The American Medical Association president, Dr. Bruce Scott, said it undermines trust and upends a transparent process that has saved countless lives. The criticisms reflect a deep concern about the politicization of what's supposed to be an independent scientific advisory body.
So what's on the agenda for the new ACIP committee that's being appointed?
Well, the new committee is chaired by Martin Kulldorff, someone known for opposing COVID vaccines and lockdowns. They've already announced working groups tasked with reviewing the entire U.S. children's vaccination schedule.
Reviewing the whole schedule.
Yes, specifically looking at the cumulative effect of vaccines. That's a concern often raised by vaccine critics. They also plan to specifically re-examine vaccines like hepatitis B and MMR, claiming they haven't been reviewed thoroughly enough recently. Critics see this agenda as potentially signaling a move to question or dismantle long-established evidence-based public health recommendations.
The implications for public health and public trust seem pretty significant then.
They really are. This whole situation raises that fundamental question. How do you maintain public trust and encourage evidence-based decisions when the very institutions meant to provide that impartial scientific guidance are being challenged and restructured so visibly, so controversially? The AMA has already flagged concerns about declining vaccination rates generally in the U.S. and the potential for more outbreaks of preventable diseases. There's real worry among medical professionals that ACP might become politicized, losing its credibility as an impartial source. They fear doctors and health organizations might start turning away from ACIP guidance, leading to more confusion and fragmentation in public health efforts. It really feels like a critical moment for public health science in the U.S., especially since Kennedy had already bypassed the outgoing ACP when changing COVID guidance earlier, setting a precedent.
We have certainly covered a huge amount of ground today. We went right back to the start, the fraudulent claims about MMR and thimerosal, and traced how the overwhelming scientific consensus formed against those links.
Yeah, a massive body of evidence there.
But we also explored that other thread, the scientific arguments being made by some researchers regarding aluminum adjuvants, presenting correlations, biological hypotheses. Even if, as you said, that research isn't yet conclusive or widely accepted in the way the MMR thimerosal debunking is, it's clear it's not a simple single story.
Not at all. It's got many complex layers, far more than you get from just reading headlines. And for you, the listener, the goal remains the same: trying to make informed decisions. That means looking at the robust, peer-reviewed evidence, listening to trusted health organizations like the CDC, but also understanding the complexities, knowing where the scientific debate is still happening and what the different arguments are. It's about being discerning, especially in a world just flooded with information.
So maybe here's a final thought to leave you with, something to mull over after this deep dive. Given the clear, systematic debunking of some of the most prominent vaccine autism claims, like MMR and the thimerosal, yet the existence of other scientific literature that does continue to raise questions about specific components, like aluminum adjuvants, even if it's based on correlation or plausibility arguments, rather than proven causation accepted by the broad consensus. How do we, as a society, navigate these kinds of nuanced scientific discussions and disagreements?
That's the challenge.
How do we do it in a way that genuinely serves public health, protecting everyone, especially the vulnerable? How do we avoid just falling prey to fear or speculation or maybe even politically motivated narratives on either side? What is the real cost, not just in dollars, but in actual human lives, and maybe in the erosion of that crucial trust when the foundations of science and public health guidance are constantly being challenged or undermined? But sadly, it seems we've run out of time for today.
Thank you so much for listening and for being such an engaged part of our podcast.
We always value your participation.
Until our next deep dive together.
Goodbye for now, and we'll see you next time.